Shivering in the freezing rain of a London alley, the former toast of Mayfair clutched a velvet box that held her absolute last lifeline. Across the cobblestones, the Duke of Alderley watched the woman he had secretly loved for 5 years step into a seedy pawnshop, knowing he finally had to make a choice. The winter of 1893 was one of the most unforgiving London had seen in a decade. The Thames was choked with ice, and a thick, yellow smog clung to the city streets like a shroud. For Adelaide Somerset, the biting cold was the least of her worries. Only 3 years ago, she had been Adelaide Harrington, the radiant bride of Lord Tommy Somerset, dancing in the grand ballrooms of Hyde Park under chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds. Now, she was a ghost of her former self, navigating the treacherous, muddy alleys of Cheapside with her head bowed, praying she would not be recognized. The tragedy of her ruin was a quiet, suffocating one. Her husband, Tommy, had been a man of immense charm, a poet's soul with a reckless streak that the society papers had found endlessly endearing. What the papers in Adelaide did not know was that Tommy's charm was a carefully constructed mask hiding a disastrous gambling addiction. When Tommy died suddenly of a supposed heart failure in a secluded French chateau the previous autumn, the mask shattered. The creditors descended on the Somerset estate like vultures. It turned out that Tommy had mortgaged everything. The grand house in Belgravia, the rolling estates in Sussex, even the horses in the stables, all of it belonged to faceless bankers and ruthless men of the London underworld. They took the furniture, the paintings, the silver. When the formidable firm of Grigsby & Co. finally finished their ruthless audit, Adelaide was left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small velvet reticule hidden beneath her mattress containing the last of her personal, unregistered jewelry. Cast out from the polite society that once adored her, Adelaide found herself renting a damp, drafty room above a baker's shop. Her friends had swiftly turned their backs. The scandal of a destitute widow was too contagious. Survival had stripped her of her pride. Over the past 4 months, she had quietly sold off her pearl earrings, her gold bracelets, and the silver combs from her hair, just to buy coal and meager rations of bread and tea. But today, the money was entirely gone, and the landlord was demanding rent by nightfall, threatening to turn her out into the snow. She had only one item left, the Harrington sapphire. It was an heirloom brooch her grandmother had given her on her wedding day, a breathtaking cornflower blue stone surrounded by flawless cut diamonds. It was worth a small fortune, but in the desperate, shadowy world of East End pawnshops, she knew she would be lucky to get a fraction of its value. Wrapping her threadbare woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders, Adelaide pushed open the heavy oak door of Ebenezer Fitch's Antiquities and Loans. A bell jingled ominously above her. The shop smelled of old paper, damp wool, and desperation. What Adelaide did not know, what she could not possibly have known, was that she had been followed. Edward Pendleton, the 9th Duke of Alderley, stood in the shadows of the alleyway across the street, the collar of his heavy astrakhan coat turned up against the wind. His jaw was clenched so tight it ached. Edward was a man of the old world, stoic, intensely private, and burdened with a sense of duty that bordered on the monastic. He was also a man who had loved Adelaide Harrington since the first moment he saw her at a garden party 5 years ago. Edward had intended to propose to her. He had even spoken to her father. But before he could formalize his intentions, the charming, vivacious Tommy Somerset had swept into her life, reciting romantic poetry and promising her the world. Edward, realizing that Adelaide was entirely enamored with Tommy, had done the honorable thing. He stepped aside. He had watched her marry another man, bearing his heartbreak beneath a mountain of parliamentary duties and estate management. But when the news of Tommy's scandalous death and the subsequent financial ruin reached Edward's ears, he had immediately mobilized his vast resources. For months, Edward had employed private investigators to track the tangled web of Tommy's debts, trying to find Adelaide. She had vanished so thoroughly, hiding her shame so deeply, that even the Duke's men struggled to locate her. It was only by a stroke of luck, a tip from a former Somerset maid who had seen Adelaide buying bread in Spitalfields, that Edward had finally found her this morning. He had watched from his carriage as the woman who once wore silk and pearls stepped out of a dilapidated boarding house, looking fragile and exhausted. Every instinct screamed at him to rush forward, to wrap her in his coat, to carry her away to his estate and lay the world at her feet. But Edward was a brilliant strategist. He knew Adelaide's pride. She was a Harrington. If he offered her charity, if he swooped in like a wealthy savior to toss coins at her feet, she would reject him out of sheer humiliation. He needed a way to save her without breaking the fragile remnants of her dignity. Watching her disappear into the pawn shop, Edward made his choice. He stepped out of the shadows, his silver-tipped cane striking the cobblestones with deadly resolve, and crossed the street. Inside the dim, dusty shop, Adelaide placed the velvet box on the scratched mahogany counter. Behind the iron grill stood Ebenezer Fitch, a stout, sour-faced man with a jeweler's loop screwed into his right eye. He opened the box, and even in the poor light, the Harrington sapphire caught the ambient shadows and fired them back as brilliant, oceanic light. Fitch's breath hitched for a fraction of a second, but he quickly masked his reaction with a dismissive grunt. "Old cut," Fitch muttered, poking the sapphire with a dirty fingernail. "Setting is tarnished. The diamonds are flawed. Very difficult piece to move, madam. Tastes have changed. People want modern stones. That is a flawless Ceylon sapphire, Mr. Fitch," Adelaide said, her voice trembling but striving for firmness. "It has been in my family for 3 generations. It is worth at least £400. 400? Fitch laughed, a dry, grating sound. "You must be mad. Or desperate. I'll give you £20 for it, and I'm doing you a favor at that." 20? Adelaide felt the blood drain from her face. £20 would pay her rent and buy her food for a month, but it was an insulting, predatory theft of her family's legacy. "Sir, I implore you. 30. Give me £30, and I will leave." 15. Fitch snapped, recognizing her desperation and closing the trap. "Take it, or take your bauble and walk out into the snow." Adelaide closed her eyes, fighting the hot sting of tears. She had lost her husband, her home, her reputation, and her friends. Now, she was losing the very last piece of her heritage to a thief in a dirty shop. She slowly extended her hand to take the £15. "The lady will not be accepting that offer." The voice was deep, resonant, and carried the undeniable authority of a man used to absolute obedience. Adelaide gasped and spun around. There, standing in the doorway, was Edward Pendleton, the Duke of Alderley. He looked immense in the cramped space, his broad shoulders filling the aisle, his dark eyes fixed on the pawnbroker with an expression of freezing disdain. "Your Grace," Fitch stammered, instantly recognizing the famous nobleman. The pawnbroker practically tripped over himself, bowing behind the counter. I did not expect such distinguished company." Adelaide felt the floor tilt beneath her. Of all the people in London to witness her at her absolute lowest, it had to be Edward. She remembered him from the grand balls, the quiet, intense Duke who had always looked at her with an inscrutable gaze. Shame washed over her like a tidal wave. She reached for the velvet box. "Excuse me," she whispered, her face burning. "I must go." "Adelaide, wait." Edward stepped forward, gently but firmly placing his gloved hand over hers to stop her from taking the box. His touch sent a strange jolt through her. He didn't look at her with pity, which she had dreaded. He looked at her with a fierce, protective intensity. Edward turned his gaze back to the pawnbroker. "Mr. Fitch, you are attempting to purchase the Harrington sapphire, a piece of renowned historical provenance, for £15. That is not a transaction. That is a crime. Your Grace, I assure you, the market value is precisely £500, Edward interrupted, his voice like cracking ice. He reached into his coat, produced a leather billfold, and counted out 5 crisp, 100-pound Bank of England notes, laying them flat on the glass counter. "I am purchasing this brooch," Edward declared, not looking at Fitch, but looking down at Adelaide, "for my personal collection. It is a fair investment." Adelaide stared at the small fortune sitting on the glass. 500 pounds. It was enough to start over. Enough to leave London, to buy a small cottage in the country, to live in peace. But the charity of it burned her throat. "Edward, your Grace," she corrected herself, stepping back. "I cannot accept this. It is charity. I know what you are doing, and while I am grateful, I will not be your charity case." Edward picked up the notes, placed them in Adelaide's numb hands, and then picked up the velvet box, slipping it into his pocket. "It is not charity, Adelaide. It is commerce. I have acquired a magnificent piece of jewelry, and you have acquired its fair market value. But please, let us not conduct our business in this damp cavern." Before she could protest, Edward placed a hand on the small of her back and guided her out of the shop and into the biting cold of the street, where his black carriage was waiting, the horses blowing plumes of steam into the air. "Get in," he commanded gently. "You are freezing." "Edward, I must walk home." "I have rent to pay," she insisted, clutching the money. "You are not going back to Spitalfields," Edward said, blocking the street. The wind whipped his dark hair, but his eyes were steady. "You don't need to pay the rent, Adelaide, because as of yesterday afternoon, you don't owe that landlord anything. In fact, you don't owe Grigsby and Co. anything. You don't owe the banks, or the tailors, or the bookmakers." Adelaide froze. The smog seemed to clear for a terrifying second. "What are you talking about?" Edward took a deep breath, the confession heavy on his chest. "When Tommy died, I knew what would happen. I knew the wolves would come for you. I tried to find you, but you ran too fast. So, I did the only thing I could to protect you from afar." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. "I bought them, Adelaide. I bought every single promissory note, every mortgage, every gambling marker Tommy ever signed. I spent £40,000 acquiring your husband's debts. Grigsby and Co. no longer holds your fate." Adelaide stared at him, horror and confusion warring in her chest. The rain began to fall harder, soaking her bonnet. You bought my debt?" "I did. So." Her voice broke. "So I am not free. I just have a new master. You. I owe you £40,000. "You owe me nothing," Edward said, his voice dropping to a desperate rasp. He stepped closer, uncaring of the mud or the rain or the passing strangers. "Adelaide, I didn't buy the debt to hold it over you. I bought it to burn it. I bought it so no man could ever threaten you, evict you, or degrade you again." "Why?" she cried out, the emotional toll of the last year finally shattering her composure. Tears mixed with the freezing rain on her cheeks. "Why would you do this for me? I chose Tommy. I humiliated you when I married him." Edward looked at her, his aristocratic mask finally slipping, revealing the raw, enduring agony of a man who had waited half a decade in the shadows. "Because you made a choice 5 years ago, Adelaide," Edward whispered, the intensity of his words cutting through the howling wind. "And now, it is my turn to make mine." The carriage ride to Marylebone was shrouded in heavy, suffocating silence. Adelaide sat huddled against the plush velvet squabs, the warmth of the heated bricks at her feet, feeling entirely foreign after months of bone-chilling dampness. Across from her, Edward stared out the rain-streaked window, his jaw set in a rigid line. He had practically kidnapped her from the slums, handed her an empire's worth of debt, and confessed a devastating truth. When the carriage finally rolled to a halt in front of a pristine, cream-stuccoed townhouse on Wimpole Street, Adelaide hesitated. "This is not my home, Edward," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the pounding rain. It is a property I maintain for my dowager aunt, who is currently wintering in Bath, Edward replied, stepping out and offering his gloved hand. It is fully staffed, entirely secure, and completely at your disposal. I will not be staying here. You will have your privacy. True to his word, Edward escorted her only as far as the grand foyer. He handed her over to the care of Mrs. Higgins, a fiercely maternal housekeeper, who whisked Adelaide away to a suite of rooms that smelled of lavender and beeswax. Before he left, Edward withdrew the thick, red wax-sealed envelope from his coat, the very envelope containing £40,000 of Tommy's ruined legacy. He placed it on the silver salver by the door. "Burn it, Adelaide," Edward said softly, his dark eyes meeting hers with unwavering intensity. "Cast it into the drawing-room fire tonight, or keep it as proof of your independence. But know that from this moment forward, no man holds a claim on you." With a sharp bow, he turned and walked back out into the storm. For 3 days, Adelaide lived in a state of suspended animation. She ate rich broths and freshly baked bread until the hollows in her cheeks began to soften. She bathed in hot water scented with rose oil, washing away the grime and despair of the East End. Yet, the opulent surroundings felt like a gilded cage. The trauma of Tommy's deception had left deep, jagged scars on her psyche. She could not simply accept that a man, even a man of Edward's legendary honor, would spend a fortune purely out of altruistic devotion. She kept waiting for the trap to spring. She kept waiting for Edward to demand his recompense. On the 4th afternoon, that just footman delivered a battered leather trunk to her rooms. It was her meager belongings, retrieved from the damp room in Spitalfields by Edward's men. Among the threadbare dresses and cracked shoes was Tommy's old leather writing desk. She had only kept it because the brass fittings were worth a few shillings. Sitting by the window, bathed in the pale winter sunlight, Adelaide ran her fingers over the scuffed leather. A sudden, overwhelming anger seized her. She struck the side of the box, wanting to shatter the last physical reminder of the man who had destroyed her life. There was a sharp crack. The interior base of the writing desk shifted. Adelaide froze. She pried at the loose wooden panel with her fingernails until it popped free, revealing a hidden, velvet-lined compartment. Inside lay a small, black ledger and a bundle of letters bound in rotting twine. Her heart hammering against her ribs, Adelaide broke the twine. The letters were addressed to Tommy, but the sender was not a bookmaker or a tailor. The signature at the bottom of the first page belonged to Reginald Croft, a name Adelaide recognized from the whispered scandals of society, a ruthless extortionist who operated from the shadows of Covent Garden. She began to read, and with every line, the blood drained from her face. Tommy had not just lost their fortune at the faro tables. He had been blackmailed. 4 years ago, during a weekend shooting party at Alderley Park, Edward's country estate, Tommy had slipped into the Duke's private study. Desperate to cover a staggering gambling debt, Tommy had stolen £10,000 in unregistered bearer bonds from Edward's safe. Reginald Croft had somehow acquired proof of the theft and had bled Tommy dry ever since, threatening to expose him to Scotland Yard. Adelaide dropped the letter, her hands shaking violently. She opened the black ledger. It was a meticulous, damning record of Tommy's payoffs to Croft. But it was the final entry, dated just 2 weeks before Tommy's sudden death in France, that made the room spin. Alderley knows. He summoned me today. He noticed the missing bonds years ago and traced the serial numbers. He has the proof. He is going to ruin me. Adelaide gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. Edward had known. For years, Edward had known that the man she chose over him was a thief who had robbed him blind. Yet, Edward had never pressed charges. He had never sent the police to their door in Belgravia. He had watched Adelaide parade through ballrooms wearing jewels bought with his stolen money, and he had remained utterly, impossibly silent. And then, when Tommy died, likely from the sheer terror of his impending ruin, Edward had stepped in to buy up the remaining debts, protecting the widow of the man who had betrayed him. The weight of Edward's sacrifice was entirely crushing. It was not just £40,000. It was his pride. It was his absolute refusal to let Adelaide's name be dragged through the mud of a criminal trial. He had guarded her dignity at the cost of his own justice. She could not hide from this. She could not simply burn the envelope and pretend she was free. "Mrs. Higgins!" Adelaide called out, her voice ringing with a newfound, desperate authority. She stood up, clutching the black ledger to her chest. "Send a messenger to the Duke of Alderley immediately. Tell him I must see him. Tonight." Edward arrived at Wimpole Street just as the grandfather clock in the hall struck 8. He wore impeccable evening dress, looking every inch the formidable peer of the realm, but the dark circles beneath his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. He found Adelaide standing by the roaring fire in the drawing room. She was wearing a simple gown of midnight blue silk, one of the garments Mrs. Higgins had procured for her, and her dark hair was pinned up elegantly. She looked like the magnificent duchess she was always meant to be, but her eyes were blazing with a mixture of fury and profound grief. "You asked to see me, Adelaide?" Edward asked softly, stepping into the room but keeping his distance. Adelaide did not speak. She simply walked to the low mahogany table between them and tossed the black ledger and the letters onto it. Edward's gaze dropped to the table. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine shock crossed his stoic features. Then, his face hardened into an impenetrable mask. He closed his eyes and let out a long, ragged breath. "Where did you find those?" he asked quietly. "Hidden in his writing desk," Adelaide replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "Why, Edward? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you send him to prison?" Edward walked over to the table and picked up the bundle of letters. Without a word, he tossed them directly into the flames. They watched in silence as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. "Because a scandal of that magnitude would have destroyed you," Edward finally said, turning to face her. The emotional walls he had built over 5 years were finally crumbling. If Tommy had been convicted of grand larceny, his assets would have been seized immediately. "You would have been destitute 3 years ago, branded the wife of a felon, cast out of society with a permanent stain on your name. I would not allow the woman I loved to bear the punishment for a coward's crime." "The woman you loved," Adelaide echoed, a tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her cheek. "Edward, I chose him. I was blind and foolish, and I let myself be swept away by pretty words, while a truly honorable man stood right in front of me. And in return, my husband robbed you, and I wore gowns paid for with your stolen money. The humiliation is unbearable. You bear no guilt in this, Adelaide." Edward closed the distance between them, his voice rising in sudden, fierce passion. He reached out, his hands hovering just inches from her arms, desperate to hold her, but terrified of crossing a line. "Tommy deceived us all. But you must understand. I did not buy your debts to make you feel beholden to me. I did not keep his secrets to trap you in gratitude. I did it because your survival, your dignity, means more to me than my own life." Adelaide looked up into his eyes, seeing the raw, unguarded agony of a man who had loved her from the shadows for half a decade. Edward slowly reached into his evening coat and withdrew a sleek, leather portfolio. He placed it gently into her hands. "What is this?" she whispered. "It is a sovereign choice," Edward said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "Inside is a document establishing a trust in your name, funded with £50,000. It is completely irrevocable. I cannot touch it. No creditor can touch it. There is also a first-class ticket on the White Star Line bound for New York, departing from Southampton in 3 days. I have secured a beautiful home for you in Manhattan, overlooking the park." Adelaide stared at the portfolio, her heart shattering. "You are sending me away?" "I am setting you free," Edward corrected, taking a painful step back. "You have spent the last 3 years trapped by a man's deception, and the last 4 months trapped by poverty. I will not be another warden. If you stay here, London society will eventually learn of my patronage, and they will whisper that you are my kept woman or my charity case. I will not subject you to their poison. Take the money. Go to America. Build a life where no one knows the name Somerset and where you never have to bow your head to anyone ever again." "And what about you?" Adelaide asked, her voice cracking. Edward offered her a sad, devastating smile. "I will remain in London. I have my duties in the House of Lords, and I will have the peace of knowing that you are safe and happy and completely free." As Edward's hand closed over the brass doorknob, Adelaide looked at the portfolio in her hands. She thought of the cold, muddy alley in Cheapside. She thought of Tommy's empty poetry and cowardice. And then she looked at the broad shoulders of the man at the door, a man who had protected her in secret, shielded her from ruin, and was now offering her an empire and asking for absolutely nothing in return. Freedom wasn't a ticket to New York. Freedom was finally seeing the truth and making a choice with her eyes wide open. "Edward, stop." Edward froze, his hand still on the knob. Adelaide walked over to the fireplace. With a deliberate, steady hand, she opened the leather portfolio, took out the first-class ticket to New York, and dropped it into the roaring fire. The thick cardstock caught instantly, flaring bright orange before dissolving into ash. Edward turned around, his eyes wide with shock. "Adelaide, what are you doing?" "I am making a choice," she said, her voice clear, strong, and completely devoid of the fear that had haunted her for months. She walked toward him, the heavy blue silk of her gown whispering against the carpet. "You are right, Edward. I have been trapped. But I do not wish to run away to America to be alone. I have spent enough time being alone while married to a ghost." She stopped right in front of him, looking up into his astonished face. "You kept Tommy's secrets to protect my dignity," Adelaide said softly, reaching up to rest her hand against the solid warmth of his chest, feeling the rapid, heavy thumping of his heart beneath the starched white shirt. "You bought my debts to give me my life back. You offered me the world, and you asked for nothing. But there is one thing I want you to ask of me. Edward Pendleton." Edward's breath hitched. He brought his hands up, finally, letting them rest on her waist. "Tell me," he whispered desperately. "Ask me to stay," she breathed, her eyes shining with tears of absolute certainty. "Not as your charity, not as your ward, but as your partner. Ask me to stay because you love me, and because I have been a fool not to love you in return." A sound escaped Edward's throat, a ragged, overwhelmed sound of a man who had just been handed salvation. He pulled her flush against him, burying his face in her dark hair, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, possessive tenderness that promised she would never know the cold again. "Stay," Edward murmured against her skin, holding her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the universe. "Stay with me, Adelaide. Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice." Adelaide wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face against his shoulder, finally allowing herself to truly weep, not tears of sorrow or fear, but tears of profound, overwhelming relief. The rain continued to batter the windows of the Marylebone townhouse, washing away the grime of the city and the ghosts of her past. Within the warm, firelit sanctuary of Edward's arms, the destitute widow vanished, and the future Duchess of Alderley was finally, truly, home. Did Adelaide make the right choice, or would you have taken the ticket to New York? If this tale of betrayal, sacrifice, and unexpected love captured your heart, please hit that like button and share it with your fellow romance lovers. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another dramatic historical romance. Tell us your thoughts in the comments below.